It all began with a handshake. Cameras flashed as President Donald Trump stood beside Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at the G7 summit, each leader smiling as they announced plans to pursue a new trade deal within a month. But beneath the polished smiles and diplomatic gestures, a storm was brewing, one that would tear through economies, devastate industries, and unravel decades of cross-border friendship. What looked like progress was, in fact, the beginning of an economic and political collapse no one fully saw coming. This wasn't just another round of negotiation. It was the spark that lit the fuse of a full-blown trade war. What happened next defied expectations. Even as Trump talked trade, governors across the northeastern United States were already feeling the tremors of economic disaster. Canadian tourism, a key economic driver for states like Massachusetts, Maine, and Vermont, was vanishing overnight. Streets once buzzing with Canadian shoppers were falling silent. Hotels that had hosted the same French-Canadian families for decades were reporting record cancellations. The signs were everywhere. Empty reservation books, vacant restaurants, and highways that had carried tens of thousands of Canadian visitors now eerily still. In response, Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey didn't wait for Washington to act. She invited fellow governors from New York, Vermont, Connecticut, and beyond to Boston, where they sat down, without cameras or ceremony, with Canadian provincial leaders. The goal was urgent and clear. How could they protect their regional economies from a trade war they never asked for? Why was one handshake not enough to hold back this wave of damage? And why, in a country so deeply intertwined with Canada, did a show of diplomacy turn into a show of division? How do you think trade decisions should be made? By Washington or by the states who live through the consequences? And before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the African Web for more deep dive reports into the decisions shaping global power and their real-world effects. The damage came fast and brutal. As Trump slapped 25% tariffs on Canadian energy, lumber, and aluminum, states on the U.S. side of the border started bleeding economically. In Massachusetts, hotels were reporting a drop of up to 60% in Canadian tourists, and it was only June. Flights from Canada into Boston's Logan Airport were plummeting. Canadian homeowners in Florida were fleeing, pulling out of seasonal properties they once called home for half the year. One Massachusetts official summed it up plainly: Canada is our biggest trading partner. Trump is taxing our states like they're the enemy. The effects weren't limited to tourism. Lumber prices surged, bringing construction projects to a halt. Affordable housing developments froze overnight. Builders couldn't afford the material costs anymore. Aluminum prices hit the craft beer industry hard. Cans were stacking up in warehouses, unsold, unused. Layoffs began. Small businesses struggled to survive. In Vermont and New Hampshire, where Canadian tourism once funded entire local economies, storefronts began shuttering. This wasn't an economic theory, it was a collapse unfolding in real time. With Washington silent, local leaders sprang into action. Governor Healey's emergency summit in Boston marked a historic shift. Governors taking up the mantle of foreign policy out of necessity, not ambition. The gathering brought together Canadian premiers and U.S. governors around one purpose: survival. These leaders weren't there to pose for photos. They were there to form new energy partnerships, negotiate cross-border tourism packages, and explore bilateral rail projects. They even began pushing for waivers on critical materials like lumber and aluminum to protect local industries. The tone was serious, the intent unmistakable. If the federal government wouldn't act, they would. They were no longer waiting for President Trump to repair what he had broken. This was no longer about national politics. It was about protecting workers, saving businesses, and defending the economies of cities and towns across the region. On the ground, the damage was devastating. In Old Orchard Beach, Maine, a popular destination just 150 miles from the Canadian border, hotel owner Sterling Morse flipped through last year's reservation cards. Most bore Canadian flags. This year's stack was empty. We're down 90%, he said. They're angry and they're not coming. For decades, families had visited the same hotels, the same beaches, the same towns. That connection was gone. Entire businesses were collapsing under the weight of tariffs and cancellations. Waitstaff, bartenders, and housekeepers were having their hours slashed or were being let go. Seasonal economies were unraveling. In Massachusetts, the craft brewing sector, one of the largest in the U.S., was spiraling due to aluminum tariffs. Layoffs began as producers couldn't keep up with rising costs. Affordable housing efforts across the state were also grinding to a halt as Canadian lumber became too expensive to import. State officials began to realize the full scope of the crisis. The math was simple and brutal. Higher costs, fewer jobs, slower growth. And still, Washington remained silent. As governors worked overtime to contain the fallout, President Trump chose mockery over diplomacy. Instead of offering clarity or reversing course, he taunted European leaders for begging for gas and claimed his tariffs were winning. There was no outreach to Canada. No plan, just silence. But the world was watching and reacting. French President Emmanuel Macron, after meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, wasted no time shifting France's strategy. Macron signed 18 bilateral deals with China, covering everything from agriculture to aviation. He urged Europe to build strategic independence from the United States. The message was clear: if the US couldn't be trusted to lead, Europe would look elsewhere. This wasn't just a loss of Canadian tourists. It was a potential unraveling of US trade dominance. And it started at a seaside motel in Maine. Faced with escalating costs, declining revenues, and federal inaction, the Northeast states began forging their own path. Governors in New England began directly negotiating energy supply agreements with Canadian provinces. They laid the groundwork for trade partnerships, cross-border infrastructure, and tourism recovery programs, all without waiting for Washington's permission. Massachusetts led the charge. The message was loud and unified. If Trump couldn't fix it, they would. And they weren't just building policies, they were building trust. Across the border, Canadian leaders responded positively, seeking the same kind of grassroots cooperation that once defined U.S. Canada relations. The crisis had revealed something deeper: the ability of states to lead when the federal government fails. And while the damage was real, so was the determination to rebuild. What started as a handshake at the G7 summit spiraled into one of the most damaging cross-border crises in recent memory. President Trump's tariff war with Canada didn't just upset diplomats. It crippled economies, destroyed livelihoods, and tore apart decades of neighborly trust. While Washington remained silent, the governors of the Northeast stood up. They responded not with speeches, but with action, working across borders to shield their people from an economic war they never wanted. Can regional leadership truly compensate for a failing federal policy? Or is the damage too deep to undo? Share your thoughts in the comments. How do you think leaders should handle international crises that hurt local economies? If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to The African Web, where we uncover how global decisions shape the lives of everyday people.